A single event can reshape the flow of the world's wealth for 500 years. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was that kind of event. It was not merely the end of an ancient empire. It was the detonation that shattered the old economic world and launched a desperate, planet-spanning search for new routes, new riches, and new rules. By the end of this video, you will see the hidden architecture of our modern global economy, from corporate boardrooms to shipping containers, as a direct legacy of that distant crisis. We will uncover how the desperate search to bypass a single blocked strait led to the age of exploration, the creation of the stock market, and even the patterns of our digital age. How did the collapse of one city send Portuguese ships around Africa and Spanish galleons across the Atlantic? What does a 15th century siege have to do with the price of your morning coffee or the route of an internet cable under the sea? The story reveals that our world of trade is built on ancient fractures. When you look at a map of global shipping lanes today, what do you see? A modern system or an ancient echo? For centuries, the city known as Constantinople was the beating heart of the known world. Picture a metropolis where the air itself was fragrant with cinnamon and clove, where warehouses held silks so fine they felt like liquid, and where the gold coins changing hands were trusted from the vineyards of France to the ports of the Indian Ocean. This was not just a capital, it was the ultimate crossroads, the grand central station of medieval global trade. Its secret was a sliver of water, the Bosporus Strait. This narrow passage was the only maritime gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, a geographical lock that the Byzantine Empire held the key to for over 1,000 years. Every ship carrying grain from the fertile plains north of the Black Sea, every caravan arriving with spices along the Silk Road from the east, had to pass through this city's grasp. Historians like Judith Herron point to the empire's genius for administration, creating a stable, predictable environment for commerce. Their gold coin, the solidus, was so reliable it became the dollar of its day, a universal currency that built trust across vast distances. In the shadow of the magnificent Hagia Sophia, you would find a Venetian haggling over the price of pepper, an Arab merchant discussing tariffs with a Greek official, and a Russian trader offloading furs. This was a truly global marketplace, a humming engine of wealth and connection. It makes you wonder, in our modern world of countless ports and digital transactions, could any single city ever hold such concentrated power over the flow of global goods again? This entire magnificent system, however, was balanced on a knife's edge. The city's fabulous wealth was entirely dependent on one fragile thing: its ability to keep that vital strait open and under its sole control. The Golden Age was magnificent, but the foundation was about to crack. That vital strait was about to fall under a new and powerful authority. In the spring of 1453, the air around Constantinople grew thick with a different kind of tension, one felt not just by soldiers but by every merchant from Cairo to Cologne. The Ottoman siege, led by Sultan Mehmed II, represented far more than a clash of empires. It was the slow, methodical tightening of a noose around the neck of the medieval world's economic lifeline. For weeks, the Great Walls held, but with each passing day, the reality became clearer to watching Europe. The primary overland and maritime corridor to the riches of Asia was closing, perhaps forever. When the city finally passed into Ottoman hands, the change was immediate and absolute. The Bosporus now had a new gatekeeper, one who understood its value perfectly. The Ottomans imposed strict control, levying significant tariffs and asserting political dominance over all goods moving through the waterway. A Venetian trader of the time wrote with palpable despair, lamenting that the route to the Black Sea was now shut and the price of survival had become unbearable. This was not just a political shift, It was a sudden, brutal severance of a supply chain that had nourished Europe for centuries. The economic psychology of the event was one of profound shock and looming scarcity. Think of a bustling marketplace where, overnight, 3/4 of the stalls simply vanish. In the trading hubs of Venice and Genoa, merchants faced a terrifying new reality. The spices, silks, and precious stones that flowed like water through their ports were suddenly reduced to a trickle. Prices for pepper and cloves skyrocketed, becoming worth their weight in silver. Merchant guilds, the powerful corporations of their day, were thrown into panic. Their entire business model, built on reliable access to Eastern goods, was crumbling. We can picture a specific bale of fine Chinese silk, ordered months in advance, now languishing in a damp Genoese warehouse. Its intended buyer, a nobleman in Paris, would never receive it. The caravan routes across Anatolia were now fraught with uncertainty and new costs, making the old way of doing business impossibly expensive. This catastrophic disruption forced a fundamental and urgent rethink. If the door to the east was now locked and guarded, Europe faced a stark choice: accept poverty and decline, or find a new door. The desperate search for an alternative path, one that could bypass the Ottoman grip entirely, was about to launch the greatest age of exploration the world had ever seen. The shockwave of that severed trade route did not subside. It simply changed direction, flowing from the closed gates of Constantinople out toward the open and terrifying Atlantic horizon. With a land bridge to Asia now under a powerful new authority, European merchants and monarchs faced a radical proposition. If you cannot go through the obstacle, you must find a way to go around it. This was the birth of a strategy that still defines global commerce today, the principle of circumventing geopolitical barriers. And no one pursued this principle with more systematic determination than a small kingdom on Europe's western edge, Portugal, under the guidance of a prince who never sailed on a major voyage himself, Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry's vision was not born of mere curiosity. It was a calculated national project for survival and supremacy. He established a school of navigation at Sagres, a think tank where cartographers, astronomers, and shipwrights pooled their knowledge. The goal was singular and audacious: to find a sea route to the spice-rich lands of the Indies by sailing south around Africa, thereby completely bypassing the Mediterranean and the Middle East. This required more than courage; it demanded a revolution in technology. Maritime historians note the critical innovations that made this possible. The caravel, with its lateen sails, could tack against the wind, allowing explorers to voyage south and still return home against the prevailing currents. The astrolabe, adapted for use at sea, allowed navigators to calculate their latitude by measuring the angle of the sun or stars, turning the featureless ocean into a grid that could, however roughly, be charted. Portugal's effort was a century-long campaign of incremental discovery. Each expedition pushed a little further down the African coast, setting up padraos, stone pillars, to claim the land and mapping the way for the next voyage. It was a high-stakes investment with an uncertain payoff, a stark contrast to the old, predictable caravan routes where risks were known, even if the tolls were high. Then, in 1498, the gamble paid off in a historic moment. Vasco da Gama's small fleet, after a brutal journey, rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed up the east coast of Africa. With the help of a local navigator, he caught the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean and finally reached the port of Calicut in India. The cargo his ships brought back to Lisbon told the story: holds overflowing with pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. The value of this cargo was staggering, estimated to be 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. This was not just a profitable voyage, it was a thunderclap that announced a new world order. The ocean was no longer a barrier, it was a highway, and control of that highway meant control of wealth itself. It makes you wonder when we look at modern corporations investing billions to reroute supply chains around regional conflicts or to develop new trade corridors. Are we not seeing the same fundamental impulse at play, the drive to bypass a choke point? The Portuguese Gambit succeeded, and in doing so, it permanently redrew the map of global power, shifting the center of economic gravity from the enclosed Mediterranean to the open Atlantic. The thunderclap of Vasco da Gama's return echoed far beyond Lisbon's docks. It signaled a fundamental and irreversible shift, the moment the economic center of gravity of the Western world began to slide from the enclosed Mediterranean to the open Atlantic. For 1,000 years, wealth had flowed inward, converging on that inland sea. Now it began to flow outward along ocean highways that stretched to new continents. The old masters of the Mediterranean trade, the Italian city-states, were suddenly on the wrong side of history. Venice and Genoa, whose fortunes were built on their privileged position as middlemen between East and West, watched in dismay as the new ocean routes made their galleys and their political alliances obsolete. Their magnificent palaces remained, but the lifeblood of commerce was now pumping through a different heart. The new heartbeats were ports like Lisbon, Seville, and later Amsterdam and London. These were Atlantic-facing cities, built for departure and arrival on a planetary scale. Their rise was fueled by more than just a new map. It was driven by entirely new commodities and a revolutionary scale of operation. While the Mediterranean trade dealt in luxury goods for the elite, the Atlantic system dealt in bulk and basics with world-altering consequences. The most powerful example was silver. Vast quantities of the metal, mined in the Americas with immense human effort, were shipped to Seville, then across Europe and onward to Asia to pay for spices and silks. This flood of silver created the first truly global currency flow, linking the economies of 3 continents in a single, often brutal, circuit. To manage this colossal new web of trade, new institutions were born. The old merchant guilds of the Mediterranean were replaced by something far more powerful, the Joint Stock Trading Company. The most famous, the Dutch East India Company, was not just a business, it was a sovereign power in its own right, with the authority to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. It operated on a capital and geographical scale that a Venetian merchant could scarcely comprehend. This new system required new financial hubs, and none was more symbolic than the Antwerp Bourse. Here, in a purpose-built courtyard, merchants and bankers from across Europe traded not just goods, but shares in voyages and companies. It was the world's first modern stock exchange, a direct offspring of Atlantic trade's high risks and even higher rewards. This reorientation did more than change which cities were rich. It established a lasting pattern of core and periphery. The Atlantic nations of Western Europe became the commercial and political core, while the lands they traded with and colonized in the Americas, Africa, and Asia were often relegated to the role of suppliers of raw materials or markets for finished goods. This fundamental relationship, established in the 16th and 17th centuries, created imbalances that would shape global economics for centuries to come. The search for a way around a blocked strait did not just find new routes, it invented a new kind of world, one where power was measured in naval reach and financial instruments, not just control of a single sacred city. This new world of ocean highways required a new kind of engine to power it, one built not on royal treasuries alone, but on the pooled resources of an entire society. Think of a community facing a terrible storm, each person bringing what would they have to build a single, sturdy shelter. The closure of the eastern trade routes created a financial storm of similar magnitude, and the solution was a revolutionary shelter for capital, the Joint Stock Company. The old model, where a single wealthy merchant or a small family partnership funded a voyage, was utterly inadequate for the scale of transoceanic exploration. The ships were larger, the journeys lasted years, and the risk of total loss from shipwreck, conflict, or illness was staggeringly high. No single individual could shoulder that burden. The financial innovation that emerged was brilliantly simple, yet it changed everything. By selling shares in a venture to many investors, a company could raise immense sums of capital while spreading the risk across all of them. If a voyage succeeded, profits were divided according to each person's share. If it failed, no single investor was ruined. This was the birth of modern corporate finance. Historians of economics point to companies like the English Muscovy Company, chartered in 1555 to search for a northeast passage to Asia, as early formal examples. But the true giant was the Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, chartered in 1602. It was more than a company. It was a state-sanctioned entity with powers to build forts, mint coins, and wage war. Its capital was raised by selling shares to thousands of people, from wealthy burghers to shopkeepers and craftsmen. Imagine an Amsterdam baker, let's call him Hendrik. After a good year, he has a small surplus of 50 guilders. Instead of just saving it, he buys a tiny slice of the VOC. His personal fortune is now tied to the fate of a ship he will never see, loaded with nutmeg and pepper, battling the fierce winds around the Cape of Good Hope. He checks the price of shares posted on a board near the city's new exchange building, his heart lifting with good news from the Indies or sinking with word of a loss. This system created a powerful separation between the investors, who provided the money, and the operators, who managed the voyages, a fundamental principle of today's corporations. A critical companion to this idea was limited liability. It meant that Hendrik the baker could only lose the 50 guilders he invested, not his home or his bakery, if the company faced debts beyond its assets. This protection unlocked unprecedented public investment. To facilitate the buying and selling of these shares, formal stock exchanges emerged, with Amsterdam's being the most famous. Here, shares became liquid assets, traded on rumor and report, their prices fluctuating with each piece of news from across the globe. This entire architecture, born from the urgent need to replace a lost trade route, became the enduring engine of global commerce. It makes you reflect when you hear about venture capital funds pooling money to back a risky tech startup, or about massive container shipping alliances funded by global investors. Are we not seeing the direct descendant of Hendrik's 50 guilder bet? The spirit of spreading risk to fund a transformative journey, a spirit ignited by a crisis in Constantinople, now powers the very infrastructure of our connected world. That baker's small share in a distant voyage was part of a much larger and far more ruthless machine. The joint stock company was not merely a vehicle for trade, it became the sharp edge of a new philosophy. The desperate search for spices, ignited by the loss of Constantinople, quickly escalated into a global resource race, the first of its kind. Nations and their chartered companies no longer sought just to buy goods. They aimed to own the source itself, transforming commerce into a system of political dominion. This was mercantilism in action, a belief that world trade was a finite pie, and to get a bigger slice, you had to take it from someone else. Colonial-era documents from European powers are stark on this point, speaking of excluding rivals and securing monopolies for the sole benefit of the mother country. Trade was no longer a mutual exchange, it was economic warfare by other means. You can trace this brutal progression in the geography of empire. It began with simple trading posts, warehouses on a foreign shore. But to protect those assets from competitors, they became fortified factories, armed enclaves. And finally, when even that was not enough to guarantee control, they became full colonies, territories claimed by force. The Portuguese capture of the strategic port of Malacca in 1511 is a textbook case. They did not want to trade with the vibrant market there. They wanted to own the gate, to force all spice traffic through their hands and tax it. The Dutch went even further in their pursuit of the world's only source of nutmeg and mace, the Banda Islands. When the local leaders resisted a monopoly treaty, the Dutch East India Company responded with overwhelming force. The consequences were devastating for the island communities. After a period of intense conflict, the company's governor implemented a policy to secure absolute control. The existing population was largely displaced, and the islands were turned into plantations worked by enslaved people under a brutal system. A spice once traded peacefully among many in the markets of Constantinople had become a commodity that justified conquest and immense human hardship. This shift reshaped entire continents. Indigenous economies that had participated in complex, regional trade networks were often dismantled and replaced by monoculture plantations, designed to feed the insatiable European demand for sugar, tobacco, or coffee. The land itself was remade for extraction, a pattern that would define colonial economies for centuries. So, the next time you see nutmeg on your kitchen shelf, consider its journey. That tiny seed carries the weight of a profound historical shift, from a world of connected markets to a world of owned territory, a direct and sobering legacy of the scramble to replace what was lost when a single city fell. This competitive system of extraction, however, required one more critical invention to manage its sprawling, planet-sized operations. That baker's bet and the company's conquests created a system, but the goods themselves still had to move. The frantic search for new sea lanes did not erase the old patterns of trade, it supercharged them. We can draw a direct, unbroken line from the dusty camel caravans of the Silk Road to the colossal container ships queuing outside the Suez Canal today. The fundamental idea, moving goods across continents through a chain of specialized handlers, was perfected in the medieval world and simply transferred to new, faster mediums. This is the concept of logistical continuity. The ancient principles of moving value across vast distances were not invented in the age of steam, they were brilliantly adapted. Consider the journey of a single bolt of Chinese silk in the year 1300. It did not travel from weaver to Venetian buyer in one go, it moved in stages. A merchant in Samarkand would buy it, transport it to a caravanserai in Persia, sell it to another trader who might take it to Baghdad, where yet another would arrange its final leg to the docks of the Levant. At each stage, the goods were insured through informal networks, financed by letters of credit, and stored in secure warehouses. Historians of logistics point out that these caravanserais were not just inns, they were the medieval equivalents of modern port hubs like Singapore or Rotterdam, nodes of transshipment, finance, and information exchange. The collapse of the overland routes through Constantinople did not end this system. It forced it to evolve at sea. Suddenly, the value of moving huge volumes reliably across oceans skyrocketed, sparking a wave of innovation in maritime logistics. Ship designs grew larger and more specialized. The concept of general average, a maritime law dating back to antiquity, was formalized. This principle stated that if a captain had to jettison some cargo to save the ship in a storm, all merchants who owned cargo on that voyage would share the loss proportionally. It was a brilliant, early form of risk distribution that made long voyages financially viable. The paperwork evolved too. The medieval commenda contract, which outlined the terms between a ship's captain and a merchant backer, gradually transformed into the standardized bill of lading. This document, which we still use today, serves as a receipt, a contract, and a title of ownership for goods in transit. Think of the paisa, the passport issued by Mongol khans that guaranteed safe passage and assistance across the empire's vast territory. A merchant carrying one could expect food, shelter, and fresh mounts at official stations. In function, it is not so different from a modern digital customs clearance certificate, a standardized document that smooths passage through complex bureaucratic corridors. Both are tools designed to reduce friction and uncertainty in long-distance trade. So when you look at a map of the world's major shipping lanes today, you are not looking at a modern invention. You are looking at the ghost image of the Silk Road, now traced in deep blue ocean rather than tan desert. The ports of Shanghai, Rotterdam, and Los Angeles are our high-tech caravanserais. The container, a uniform metal box, is our standardized bale of silk, and the constant worry over a blocked canal or a strait threatened by conflict reveals an ancient truth. Our global supply chains, for all their technological majesty, are still vulnerable networks that depend on a handful of critical passageways. The need for secure corridors, so brutally underscored by the fall of Constantinople, remains one of the great constants of history. The cold winds of the Arctic held a different promise. As Portuguese caravels carved their southern route, other eyes turned north, driven by the same urgent need to circumvent the closed gates of the south. The dream was audacious: to find a northeast or northwest passage, a shortcut over the top of the world that would lead ships directly to the spices of Asia. This northern quest, though ultimately a geographical mirage, would reshape the map in ways its planners never intended. It began with a series of brutal, ice-clogged voyages. English explorers like Martin Frobisher and Henry Hudson braved treacherous, frozen seas, their wooden ships groaning against the pack ice, all in pursuit of a corridor that did not exist. They found not a passage to Cathay, but something else entirely: an immense, uncharted coastline and a continent ripe with other kinds of wealth. Meanwhile, from the east, the Russian expansion into Siberia was accelerating, a relentless push across a frozen frontier driven by the search for furs, a new white gold. This was not trade in the old Mediterranean sense. It was a frontier extraction economy, moving ever eastward toward the Pacific. The English, blocked in their search for a northwest route, pivoted brilliantly. In 1555, they formed the Muscovy Company, chartered to find a northeast passage. They failed to reach China, but their captain, Richard Chancellor, was blown off course into the White Sea and made landfall in Russia. This accident of navigation opened a direct northern link between England and the Tsar's court. The remote port of Archangel, ice-bound for much of the year, became a vital trading post. Here, English woolen cloth and manufactured goods were exchanged for Russian furs, timber, and wax. It was a trade that bypassed every traditional European middleman. Think of a thick sable pelt trapped in the depths of the Siberian taiga. Instead of traveling south to the markets of Constantinople or Venice, it now went north and west to line the cloaks of nobles in London or Paris. This flow created an entirely new commodity chain, independent of the old Silk Road luxuries. The northern endeavors, for all their hardship, achieved a profound result. They diversified the very geography of global trade. No longer was all wealth funneled through a single, vulnerable point. Networks now branched north into the Baltic and across Siberia, south around Africa, and soon west across the Atlantic. The world's economic map was becoming a spiderweb with multiple strands, and the severing of one no longer meant catastrophe for all. This lesson in diversification, learned through frozen hardship, is a cornerstone of modern supply chain logic. When a key supplier or route is threatened, the immediate response is to find or create an alternative. The Northern Dream failed in its original goal, but in its failure, it made the global system wider, more resilient, and far more complex. The ships that sailed these new routes carried more than spices and silver in their holds. They carried the most valuable cargo of all, knowledge. The fall of Constantinople triggered a famous diaspora of Greek scholars and texts to Italy, a flood of classical learning that helped fuel the Renaissance. But a quieter, parallel revolution was underway in the realm of practical know-how. The desperate scramble to rebuild broken trade networks forced a sudden and unprecedented sharing of commercial and technical secrets across continents. Think of it as the original open-source movement, driven not by philosophy but by sheer necessity and profit. When the old maps were rendered useless, you had to find someone with a new one. The letters of explorers like Vasco da Gama are filled with urgent requests. They speak of hunting for pilots who knew the monsoon patterns of the Indian Ocean, of bartering for Arabic portolan charts that detailed hidden harbors and treacherous currents. This was life or death information commerce, a single piece of navigational data, whispered in a Malabar coast tavern, could be the difference between a fleet arriving safely or being dashed against unseen rocks. The trade routes themselves transformed into intellectual highways. A Portuguese shipwright's innovation in hull design, developed to withstand Atlantic gales, might be observed in a Sicilian dockyard within a few years, adapted for Mediterranean conditions. The brilliant Italian system of double-entry bookkeeping, essential for tracking the complex investments in these long voyages, traveled north to Antwerp and Amsterdam with the merchants who used it. Perhaps the most profound transfers were biological. Sugarcane, a crop cultivated for centuries in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean worlds, was carried across the Atlantic. The knowledge of how to cultivate and process it traveled with the plants, leading to the establishment of plantation economies in the Caribbean and Brazil, a transfer of agricultural technique with world-altering consequences. This flow of ideas relied on a hidden class of professionals, the multilingual merchants and translators. A Gujarati trader fluent in Arabic and Portuguese, or an Armenian merchant bridging Persian and Russian markets, became a vital node in the network. They did not just translate words, they translated concepts, customs, and commercial law, smoothing the path for more than just goods to move. Consider the rapid spread of the printing press. Invented in Mainz in the mid-15th century, its technology raced along European trade routes. Print shops appeared in Venice, a major publishing hub, then in Lisbon and Seville, precisely where the new geographical knowledge was being compiled. The press itself then became a tool of commerce, mass-producing navigational manuals, standardized bills of lading, and price lists that created a more transparent and efficient market. So when we look at modern global supply chains with their real-time tracking data and open logistics platforms, we are seeing the latest chapter in this ancient story. The sharing of shipping container specifications in the 1960s, which allowed global standardization, is a direct descendant of Portuguese captains sharing wind charts. The collaborative digital maps used by freight companies today continue a 500-year tradition where trade routes thrive only when knowledge flows freely along them. This intellectual diffusion ensured that the networks once rebuilt were far smarter and more resilient than what had been lost. But the story does not simply pivot west. While European ships sailed into the unknown, the empire that now held the ancient crossroads was not a passive gatekeeper. It was building a new economic universe of its own. Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the renamed city of Istanbul transformed from a conquered prize into the dazzling capital of a vast, integrated trade network. The Grand Bazaar, a labyrinth of thousands of shops under a single vaulted roof, became the beating heart of this system. Here, Persian silk met English wool, Yemeni coffee mingled with Indian spices, and Crimean grain was traded for Egyptian cotton. The Ottomans did not block commerce, they masterfully reconfigured it, taxing and regulating the very flows that Europe was desperately trying to avoid. This was not a void, but a vibrant, alternative center of gravity. Ottoman economic historians note the sophistication of the Miri system, a state monopoly over key strategic commodities. The empire controlled vital resources like alum, essential for dyeing textiles, and the immense grain supplies from Egypt and the Black Sea region. By managing these staples, they exerted immense influence over the economies of both Europe and their own domains. Furthermore, through agreements known as the capitulations, they granted European merchants like the French and Venetians extraterritorial rights to live and trade within the empire. These were not signs of weakness but tools of statecraft, a way to attract valuable foreign commerce while keeping it firmly within an Ottoman legal and fiscal framework. Think of a French merchant, let's call him Jacques, arriving in the bustling port of Smyrna. Under the protection of his nation's capitulations, he rents a warehouse in the Frankish quarter, hires local translators and agents, and begins purchasing cotton. He operates within a complex web of Ottoman customs officials, local guild regulations, and competing European traders. It is a system with its own rules and friction, but it is a functioning, lucrative system that still connected East and West. Cities like Aleppo and Cairo flourished as major nodes within this Ottoman sphere, their caravanserais humming with activity that bypassed the sea routes entirely. This recentering forces us to confront a crucial point. The fall of Constantinople did not create one new trade world, but multiple competing ones. While Europe ventured outward on the oceans, the Ottomans consolidated a massive land and sea empire that dominated the traditional corridors. Their economic policies, their control of raw materials, and their management of foreign merchants directly influenced the mercantilist thinking taking shape in the West. European kingdoms observed Ottoman power and sought to replicate its control, but over global sea lanes rather than continental crossroads. So the next time you envision the age of exploration as a purely European saga, remember the parallel empire, the grand bazaars of Istanbul, and the French merchant Jacques. Their world was a powerful reminder that the ancient routes never fully died. They were simply governed by a new, formidable authority. And this competition between land-based and sea-based empires would set the stage for the next great transformation in global trade. That flood of silver and new goods did not just enrich merchants, it fundamentally rewired the economic reality for every person in Europe. For centuries, prices in the medieval world had been remarkably stable, governed by local harvests and slow-moving trade. But beginning in the mid-16th century, something unprecedented happened. The cost of everything from a loaf of bread to a pair of shoes began a relentless, dizzying climb that lasted for over 100 years. Historians call this the price revolution, and its origins can be traced directly back to the scramble for new trade routes. When the French philosopher Jean Bodin searched for an explanation in 1568, he pointed a clear finger at the abundance of gold and silver, which he saw flowing in from the New World and the mines of Germany. He was witnessing the first great wave of globalization-induced inflation. The chain reaction was direct, though invisible to most at the time. The search for a route to Asia led to the colonization of the Americas. There, the Spanish discovered mountains of silver at Potosi and elsewhere. Using new refining techniques and immense human effort, they extracted staggering quantities of the metal, shipping it in fleets across the Atlantic to Seville. From there, this river of silver flowed into the European economy. The basic law of money, though not fully understood then, began to work. When the amount of money in circulation increases dramatically, but the amount of goods does not keep pace, each unit of money becomes less valuable. You simply need more coins to buy the same basket of wheat or cloth. This was a macroeconomic shockwave, an echo of the geopolitical shock from 1453. The numbers tell a stark story. In England, the price of a bushel of wheat, which had hovered around 6 pence for generations, began to soar. By the end of the 16th century, it could cost over 30 pence. That is a 5-fold increase in a single lifetime. Imagine a landlord who leased his land decades earlier for a fixed annual rent paid in silver coins. As prices quintupled, the real value of his income collapsed. He was collecting the same number of coins, but they could now buy only a fraction of what they once could. Meanwhile, the merchant or farmer who sold goods into this rising market saw their nominal wealth grow. This quietly transferred economic power from the old landed aristocracy to the new commercial classes, the very people funding and benefiting from global trade. The price revolution tore apart the medieval expectation of stability. It taught the early modern world a harsh lesson that economies were now interconnected on a planetary scale. A decision in a Spanish court, a new mining technique in the Andes, or the safe arrival of a treasure fleet in Cadiz could now determine whether a family in Flanders could afford their dinner. This was the birth of a new, volatile, and truly global economic reality, one where value was no longer anchored to a local harvest, but to the turbulent flows of silver and spice across an ocean. That relentless rise in prices was fueled by a deeper change in what ships were actually carrying. The nature of trade itself was undergoing a metamorphosis, from a trickle of luxuries for the few to a flood of commodities for the many. For 1,000 years, the Silk Road and its Mediterranean extensions moved goods of incredible value but tiny volume. A single camel could carry a fortune in silk or a small chest of pepper that would serve a noble household for a year. This was elite consumption, a world apart from the daily lives of ordinary people. The new ocean networks, however, demanded a different economic logic. To justify the immense cost and risk of sending a 500-ton ship on a 2-year voyage, you could not just fill it with a few bales of silk. You needed cargo that filled the hold, cargo that had a growing, insatiable market. The search for new routes did not just find new paths to old luxuries, it created entirely new categories of global goods. This was the birth of the bulk commodity trade, and its most transformative example began with a sweet craving. Sugar, once a rare medicinal spice from the East, prized by apothecaries and kings, became the prototype. When Europeans, first the Portuguese, established sugarcane plantations on Atlantic islands like Madeira and São Tomé, they were solving a supply problem born from the old route's closure. But they were also unintentionally engineering a social revolution. By applying new methods of large-scale cultivation and processing, they began producing sugar in quantities never before seen. The price began to fall, just enough to move it from the pharmacy shelf to the banquet table of the wealthy merchant class. The demand, once awakened, proved bottomless. To meet it, the system scaled up with terrifying efficiency, transferring the plantation model to the vast lands of the Caribbean and Brazil. This was no longer the caravan trade. This was the triangular trade, a brutal new geometry of commerce. Ships from European ports carried manufactured goods like textiles and guns to West Africa. There, these goods were exchanged for captured individuals. Those same ships then crossed the Atlantic on the horrific Middle Passage, delivering their human cargo to the plantations. The holds, now emptied, were filled with raw sugar and rum for the return voyage to Europe. The entire system was an integrated machine for mass production, financed by the same joint stock companies and dependent on the long-distance shipping networks the age of exploration had built. Sugar was the first, but it was quickly joined by other democratizing commodities. Tobacco, once a sacred plant used in indigenous American ceremonies, became a global habit shipped in hogsheads. Cotton, transformed by new industrial mills in Britain, would later fuel its own empire of production and trade. Coffee, the social drink of the Ottoman world, sailed around Africa to become the morning ritual of London's new stockbrokers. Each of these followed the same pattern, transforming from rare delicacies into bulk goods that shaped everyday life across continents. We can see this shift crystallize in the story of Barbados. In the 1640s, this small island was a society of small tobacco farms. Within 2 decades, it was utterly remade. Planters, backed by London capital, cleared the forests, imported vast numbers of enslaved laborers, and planted every available acre in sugarcane. Barbados became the richest spot in the English Empire, a single crop engine pouring sweetness into the global market. Its ecology, its society, its very purpose was rewritten to feed this new, industrialized demand. So when you sweeten your coffee or pull on a cotton shirt, you are touching the end point of a supply chain whose priorities were set 5 centuries ago. The modern world runs not on silks for emperors, but on oil for our cars, grain for our bread, and lithium for our batteries, all moved in staggering bulk across the same ocean highways. Our economy is built on the principle that the search for new routes ultimately changed what we value enough to ship at all. The map of global trade today is a web of vulnerability strung between a handful of narrow gates. The strategic lesson learned at the Bosporus in 1453 did not fade with the age of sail. It became a permanent, chilling rule of geopolitics. Control the choke point, and you control the flow of wealth for nations far beyond your shores. Look at any modern map of maritime shipping lanes. You will see the same pattern repeated, thick red lines of traffic funneling through tight passages like the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, and the Suez Canal. These are the modern Bosporus Straits, the geographic bottlenecks upon which our entire interconnected system precariously balances. Geopolitical strategists often note that the security of any network is only as strong as its most vulnerable node. For global trade, those nodes are not server farms or stock exchanges. They are strips of water, often less than 20 miles wide. The Ottoman understanding of this power, controlling the Dardanelles to regulate Black Sea grain, set a template that every rising naval power would follow. The British Empire grasped it perfectly, securing Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, and the Strait of Malacca to safeguard its imperial lifeline. Today, the United States Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain, in large part to ensure the Strait of Hormuz, through which about 1/5 of the world's oil passes, remains open. A nation's foreign policy and military posture are often shaped by these invisible lines on the water. The economic impact of a single blockage is staggering. Remember the container ship Ever Given, stuck sideways in the Suez Canal for 6 days in 2021. That single vessel, a modern equivalent of a grounded galleon, held up an estimated $9.6 billion in trade per day. Hundreds of ships queued at either end, their crews and cargo trapped, a vivid demonstration of systemic fragility. It is a vulnerability that would feel hauntingly familiar to a medieval merchant. Picture, for a moment, a Venetian sailor standing on the deck of his cog in the 1440s, eyeing the formidable walls of Constantinople as his ship is inspected and taxed. Now shift the scene 500 years. A modern tanker captain from Singapore guides his colossal vessel into the Strait of Hormuz, his eyes not on stone walls but on the radar screen and the distant silhouettes of naval patrols. The anxiety is identical, a tightness in the chest born from knowing your entire voyage, and the fortunes tied to it depend on a peaceful passage through a corridor you do not control. This is the perpetual paradox of interconnected trade, a system that creates immense wealth by creating immense vulnerability. The search for new routes centuries ago diversified the network, but it could never eliminate the geographic facts that create these pinch points. Our global abundance still flows through a series of ancient, narrow doors. That tanker captain's anxiety over a narrow strait was just one part of a much larger puzzle. For global trade to function at all, it required something even more fundamental than safe passageways, a shared language of measurement. The sprawling new networks, born from desperation, created a chaotic world of incompatible local rules. A Portuguese merchant in Goa, let's call him Afonso, faces a maddening problem. He has just agreed to purchase a shipment of pepper from a local Hindu trader, with delivery set for the next new moon. But which new moon? Afonso marks his calendar by the Gregorian system, while the trader follows a lunisolar calendar tied to monsoons and harvests. The weight of the pepper is another point of confusion, measured not in the Lisbon arrêtal, but in a local unit based on seeds. Even the length of the cloth used to bundle the goods varies from port to port. This was the daily, grinding friction of early globalization, a Tower of Babel of weights, dates, and distances that made trust and efficiency nearly impossible. To overcome this, trade had to build an invisible framework, a set of universal standards that could translate value across oceans and cultures. This was not a minor detail, it was the essential infrastructure for a connected world. Historians of science point directly to the demands of navigation as the engine for this change. To know where you were at sea, you needed to accurately measure time. The search for a reliable marine chronometer, a clock that could keep precise time on a rolling ship, became a national priority for sea powers like Britain. The Longitude Prize offered by Parliament in 1714 was a massive financial incentive to solve this problem, linking accurate timekeeping directly to imperial wealth and safe trade routes. Similarly, the science of cartography evolved from artistic impression to mathematical precision, as maps became tools for navigation rather than decoration. But standardization went far beyond the ship's bridge. Slowly, out of sheer necessity, common practices emerged. Major trading ports began to enforce their own local standards, which then gained wider acceptance. The Amsterdam pound or the Venetian ducat became trusted benchmarks, not by royal decree, but by merchant consensus. The ultimate symbol of this drive is the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. Established in 1675, its core mission was to improve navigation by mapping the stars. The Greenwich meridian, 0 degrees longitude, was formally adopted as the prime meridian for the world in 1884, not by conquest but by international conference. It was a testament to the power of commerce to create a common reference point for the entire planet. This logic of standardization reached its purest physical form in the 20th century with the humble shipping container. Before its adoption, loading a ship was a slow, expensive ballet of irregular crates and sacks, vulnerable to damage and theft. The container, a uniform steel box, was a revelation. It turned chaotic ports into efficient, automated hubs. A container unloaded in Rotterdam could be seamlessly placed on a train or truck without ever being opened, because its dimensions were a global standard. This simple box, dreamed up by a trucking magnate named Malcolm McLean in the 1950s, did not invent the idea of standardized cargo. It fulfilled a need first identified centuries earlier on the docks of Lisbon and Genoa, the need to make the physical movement of goods as predictable and trustworthy as a line of longitude on a map. So when you see those stacked containers on a ship today, you are not just looking at metal boxes, you are looking at the latest chapter in a 500-year quest to build a common grammar for exchange. And this legacy continues in our digital age. The protocols that allow your computer to talk to a server on another continent, the universal product codes scanned at a supermarket, even the coordinated universal time that syncs financial markets, are all descendants of that Portuguese merchant's struggle in Goa. They are the invisible, agreed-upon rules that allow our modern, infinitely complex networks to function, proving that trade's greatest invention may not be a ship or a route, but a shared set of instructions understood by all. That shared grammar of measurement made trade possible, but it could not erase the profound fear that haunted every investor. The new ocean highways were avenues of immense opportunity and corridors of terrifying loss. A single storm, an outbreak of illness among the crew, or the sudden appearance of a rival's warship could turn a fortune into flotsam in an afternoon. To manage this paralyzing uncertainty, a new kind of institution was born, not in a royal palace, but in the smoky back room of a London coffeehouse. In the late 1600s, Edward Lloyd's establishment on Tower Street became a magnet for ship captains, merchants, and wealthy men with capital to spare. Here, over cups of bitter coffee, they would share the latest intelligence from distant ports which ships had arrived safely and which were overdue. And here they would strike deals to share the risk. A merchant planning to send a valuable cargo of tea from China could approach one of these wealthy individuals and propose a contract. For a payment, a premium, the investor would agree to cover the value of the cargo if the ship was lost. The merchant would write the details of the ship, its route, and its cargo on a piece of paper, and the investor would sign his name underneath, literally underwriting the risk. This was marine insurance, scaled up from medieval Italian practices to meet the planetary dangers of the new trade routes. Economic historians note that this system did more than just compensate for losses. It actively enabled the scale of global trade itself. By turning an unpredictable catastrophe into a predictable, manageable cost, insurance gave merchants the confidence to invest larger sums in single voyages. It transformed risk from a paralyzing fear into a calculable business expense. The coffeehouse gatherings formalized into Lloyd's of London, a marketplace for risk that became a global institution. The underwriters there developed a crude but effective form of actuarial science, pooling data on ship losses, piracy hotspots, and seasonal weather patterns to better price the premiums they charged. They were learning to put a number on the likelihood of disaster. Let's follow a specific policy written on thick parchment in a London office in 1740. It secures a shipment of fine Bohea tea aboard the merchant ship Fortune, bound from Canton to London. The merchant pays a premium of 8% of the cargo's value to a syndicate of underwriters. That piece of paper, signed and sealed, now travels faster than the ship itself, carried by other vessels back to the merchant's counting house. It is a financial promise that spans the globe, a safety net woven from ink and trust. If the Fortune founders in a gale off the Cape of Good Hope, the merchant is not ruined. He presents his policy to the underwriters and is made whole, able to finance another voyage. The loss is absorbed by the syndicate, whose diversified book of many such policies means no single shipwreck can break them. This elegant mechanism of shared risk became the indispensable safety net for globalization. It meant that a disaster in one part of the world did not have to spell financial collapse in another. The capital tied up in global ventures could be recycled, protected, and encouraged to flow again. In this way, the collective anxiety of merchants gathered in a coffeehouse built a pillar of the modern economy, proving that commerce thrives not when risk is eliminated, but when it is wisely distributed. That signed insurance policy in London was only as good as the legal framework that backed it up across borders. As trade networks stretched across oceans, they stretched beyond the reach of any single emperor's law. The old empire-guaranteed order that had once made the markets of Constantinople so stable was gone, replaced by a volatile world of competing sovereignties. To rebuild predictability, nations had to invent a new system from scratch, a web of formal agreements that would become the foundation of modern international trade law. This diplomatic revolution began not with a grand peace conference, but with a series of practical, often lopsided, deals. One of the earliest and most influential was a capitulation treaty signed in 1536 between the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and King Francis I of France. To the Ottomans, this was a tool of statecraft, a way to attract European commerce and technology while keeping foreign merchants firmly under Ottoman oversight. To the French, it was a lifeline, granting their merchants extraterritorial rights, fixed low tariffs, and legal protections within the Ottoman Empire. Legal historians point to these agreements as the direct precursors to our modern trade pacts. They established core principles we still use today. The concept of most favored nation status, for instance, was often embedded in these treaties, promising that if the Ottomans gave better terms to another nation later, the French would automatically receive them too. This created a competitive yet structured environment for cross-border exchange. but a treaty signed in Istanbul was useless if there was no one on the ground in Alexandria or Smyrna to enforce it. This need gave birth to a new diplomatic institution, the permanent embassy and consulate. Previously, ambassadors were temporary envoys sent for a specific mission. Now, nations began stationing permanent representatives in key trading capitals. Their primary job was not just politics, but commerce, to protect the property and legal rights of their merchants, resolve disputes, and send home vital market intelligence. A French consul in Aleppo became the essential interface between his nation's traders and the complex Ottoman legal system. This created a predictable channel for grievance and negotiation, replacing the arbitrary justice a lone merchant might face. The power of these bilateral treaties to reshape entire economies is perfectly illustrated by the Methuen Treaty of 1703 between England and Portugal. It was a straightforward barter deal on a national scale. Portugal agreed to admit English woolen cloth at a low tariff. In return, England agreed to tax Portuguese wines at least 1/3 less than wines from France. The results were dramatic. A river of heavy English broadcloth flowed into Portugal, undercutting local producers. In return, a river of port wine, a fortified style specifically developed to survive the sea voyage, flowed into England, creating a lasting national taste. For nearly a century, this single treaty dictated agricultural and industrial policy in both countries, locking them into a complementary trade relationship. It was a stark example of how diplomacy could deliberately channel the flow of global commodities. These frameworks, from the capitulations to the Methuen Treaty, did not create free trade in the modern sense. They created managed competitive access. They were the rules of a new game, established because the old, unspoken rules enforced by a single imperial power had vanished. They replaced the guaranteed stability of Constantinople with a negotiated, paper-thin stability between sovereign states. This fragile system of bilateral deals is the ancient bedrock upon which entities like the World Trade Organization now stand, still grappling with the same eternal questions. How do you build trust and predictability between different legal systems, and who gets to write the rules? The ink of those trade treaties built more than just legal frameworks. It built new kinds of cities on the map. Look up at the skyline of modern Singapore, a glittering forest of glass and steel towers rising from a strategic island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. Now, in your mind's eye, replace those towers with the domes and minarets of medieval Constantinople. The physical form is utterly different, but the underlying logic is identical. Both are world cities, global command centers whose power flows not from vast territory, but from their position at the crossroads of trade. This is the urban legacy of that ancient crossroads, a model perfected and then replicated across continents and centuries. Urban geographers like Saskia Sassen describe today's global cities as concentrated hubs for advanced services, finance, law, and logistics. But this is not a new phenomenon. It is the latest evolution of a 500-year chain. The journey begins with the Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa, who became wealthy not by producing goods, but by moving and financing them. When the Atlantic routes opened, power shifted to ports like Lisbon, Antwerp, and Amsterdam, cities built entirely around the machinery of ocean-going commerce. Then came the colonial entrepots, Singapore and Hong Kong, established by the British Empire explicitly as neutral ground for transshipping goods between East and West. Today, the nodes are financial capitals like London, New York, and Tokyo, where the trade is in currencies, stocks, and digital information. What defines these hubs across time is not what they make, but what they facilitate, the infrastructure that allows value to flow through them. In the 14th century, it was deep water harbors, secure warehouses, and bustling market squares. In the 21st, it is container megaports, international airports, and clusters of fiber optic cables that form the digital backbone of global finance. Consider the astonishing rise of Dubai. Little more than a pearl fishing village a century ago, its leaders made a conscious, calculated decision to model their city on the historical template of the crossroads. They invested not in oil wealth alone, but in creating the infrastructure of connection, the world's busiest international airport, artificial ports, and tax-free commercial zones. Dubai positioned itself as the neutral, efficient node between Europe, Asia, and Africa, a new Constantinople for the jet and container age. Its skyline is a monument to this ambition, a physical declaration that geography can be mastered and monetized. This enduring concentration tells us a profound truth about the spatial logic of global trade. For all our digital networks and instant communication, wealth and influence still pool in specific, tangible places. The flow may be global, but the control points remain stubbornly local. The model perfected on the Bosporus of a city thriving as a gateway and a marketplace has proven to be one of history's most resilient and powerful ideas. The demand for sugar did more than reshape societies, it reshaped the very earth beneath them. To feed the new Atlantic economy, entire ecosystems were remade. The first clearings began on islands like Madeira and the Canary Islands, where European settlers, chasing the lucrative sugar market, set fire to ancient forests to make way for orderly rows of cane. This was not merely farming, it was terraforming for profit, an ecological pivot with planetary consequences. Environmental historians frame this as part of the broader Columbian exchange, a transfer not just of goods and people, but of species, soils, and entire ways of using the land. The search for new routes and new commodities unleashed a biological reorganization of the world. Where diverse, self-sustaining landscapes once stood, vast monocultures emerged, single crops like sugar, tobacco, or cotton that drained nutrients from the soil and required constant expansion into new frontiers. This pattern of extraction, once established, became the default setting for global trade. The logic was brutally simple. A colony's value was measured by what could be shipped out, not by the long-term health of its environment. This relentless demand for resources extended far beyond the plantation. Building and maintaining the fleets that plied these new routes consumed forests of its own. An English warship of the line, the backbone of naval power that protected trade, required the timber of over 2,000 oak trees, each needing a century or more to mature. The dockyards of Europe and later America became engines of deforestation, pulling timber from Scandinavia, the Baltic, and the American colonies. The trade networks, in effect, became systems for redistributing the planet's biomass, converting ancient woodlands into hulls and masts. This resource hunger only intensified with the Industrial Revolution, which was itself fueled by the capital and raw materials of global trade. The coal that powered steam engines and the iron for railways were mined on an unprecedented scale to move commodities that were grown on land cleared on another continent. The system became a loop of extraction, production, and consumption that operated on a geological scale. Perhaps no case study illustrates this unintended ecological transformation more starkly than the fate of the Atlantic cod. For centuries, the Grand Banks off Newfoundland were a legendary abundance, a seemingly endless protein source for Europe. Basque and later English fishermen, following the new Atlantic routes, harvested these cold waters with increasing efficiency. The cod, salted and dried, became a staple food that fueled the population growth of Europe and fed enslaved populations on Caribbean plantations. It was a perfect trade commodity, durable, nutritious, and plentiful. But the very efficiency of the trade network sealed its fate. By the late 20th century, after 500 years of intensive fishing pressure driven by global demand, the cod populations collapsed. A fishery that had sustained economies and diets for half a millennium was brought to the brink of commercial extinction by the very supply chains it helped support. The story of the cod is a quiet echo of the cleared forests of Madeira, a reminder that the rerouting of trade in the 15th century did more than change maps. It changed the biological fabric of the oceans and the land, setting human civilization on a course of planetary environmental management whose consequences we are still navigating today. The relentless hunger of those global markets created a new kind of thirst, one for information itself. A Dutch East India Company factor, sweating in his stone-walled office in Batavia, knew his most valuable export was not the spices in the warehouse, but the words on the page before him. His quill scratched out a detailed report on the local price of pepper, the political mood of the Javanese court, and the rumored arrival of an English competitor. This single letter, sealed with wax, represented a fortune in potential advantage or avoided disaster. Yet its journey was agonizingly slow, entrusted to a creaking East Indiaman that would take 6 months or more to reach Amsterdam. In that vast span of time, the entire market could collapse, a war could break out, or a rival could seize the opportunity. The physical networks of trade had outrun the speed of the knowledge needed to manage them. This gap between the movement of goods and the movement of news became the single greatest bottleneck to profit and power, sparking a relentless drive to close it. Historians of communication point directly to commerce as the engine behind every major leap in information technology, from the postal service to the telegraph. The need to coordinate distant agents, settle accounts, and anticipate market shifts demanded systems that were reliable, regular, and fast. This is why the first organized mail services in Europe were not royal decrees for lovers or poets, but commercial contracts. Merchant guilds and trading companies established regular packet boat services and courier networks, understanding that a letter about a price change was as vital as the cargo itself. These early systems gave rise to the first true news networks, where correspondents in foreign ports would send regular dispatches that were compiled into price currents and shipping lists, the newsletters of their day. The information in these sheets was raw financial power. Think of a London underwriter at Lloyd's, his decision to insure a voyage to the Caribbean hinging on a 2-month-old report from Barbados about hurricane season. His risk was a calculation in the dark. The pressure to shine a light to collapse time and distance was immense. It led to the codification of commercial language itself. Standardized bills of lading and letters of credit reduced ambiguity, but for truly sensitive information, merchants developed elaborate ciphers and codes. A seemingly innocent phrase in a letter home, like "Our cousin enjoys good health," could be decoded by a partner to mean "The price of indigo has fallen, sell immediately." This was the dawn of encrypted data, born from the need for secure financial transmission across insecure distances. The ultimate breakthrough came with harnessing electricity. The electric telegraph, often hailed for uniting continents, found its first and most profitable use in commerce. Its wires strung along railway lines and across the countryside were not carrying poetry. They were carrying the price of wheat in Chicago and the arrival time of ships in Liverpool. The famous anecdote of the Rothschild family's fortune is rooted in this transition. Nathan Rothschild in London was said to have used a private network of pigeon posts and later, Keenly, the first commercial telegraph lines to receive news of the Battle of Waterloo a full day before the British government. This advanced knowledge of Napoleon's defeat allowed him to make calculated moves in the bond market, turning strategic information into staggering wealth. The story, while perhaps embellished, perfectly illustrates the principle. In trade, information is not just power, it is currency. The telegraph transformed markets from a series of local pools into a single, reacting organism. A frost in Brazil could now spike coffee prices in New York within hours, not months. This real-time connectivity was the final piece in building the modern global market, a nervous system to match the circulatory system of ships and rails. So when you see the flickering numbers of a stock ticker or the live freight rates on a shipping broker's screen, you are witnessing the ultimate expression of that Dutch factor's struggle. The entire architecture of our digital age, with its instantaneous data flows and algorithmic trades, answers a question first asked on a slow boat from Batavia: how fast can we know? That hunger for information traveled along the same routes as the people who carried it. The new trade networks did not just move spices and silver, they moved human beings on an unprecedented scale, creating vast diasporas that became the living, breathing infrastructure of global commerce. When we think of trade, we often picture ships and ledgers, but the most vital component was always the communities who spanned cultural divides. Consider the Armenian merchants of New Julfa. After being resettled by the Safavid Shah outside his capital of Isfahan in the early 1600s, this community did not simply rebuild, they built a commercial empire of trust. Using a sophisticated system of family agents and written promissory notes, they established trading posts that stretched from the heart of the Ottoman Empire all the way to the Spanish colony of Manila in the Philippines. An Armenian merchant in Madras could send a letter of credit that would be honored by his cousin in Amsterdam, a network of faith and kinship that functioned as a proto-global banking system. They were cultural and linguistic brokers, fluent in the customs of multiple empires, and they thrived in the gaps between the great powers, proving that human networks could be as powerful as naval fleets. This pattern of diaspora as commercial bridge repeated across the world. Chinese merchant communities established themselves throughout Southeast Asia, in places like Malacca and Batavia, facilitating the flow of porcelain, tea, and local goods between their homeland and European traders. Lebanese families spread across West Africa and the Americas, creating import-export businesses that connected continents. Diaspora studies highlight how these groups maintained a dual identity, rooted in their homeland culture while becoming essential intermediaries in their host societies. They possessed what economists now call relational capital, a deep reservoir of trust and shared understanding that reduced the crippling transaction costs of cross-cultural trade. A handshake between two merchants from the same village, even if that village was a memory thousands of miles away, carried more weight than any formal contract could. These voluntary migrations of merchants, artisans, and skilled workers wove a resilient human web that held the new global economy together. Yet the same ocean highways that carried these voluntary migrants also enabled the largest forced migration in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. This tragic expansion was a direct, horrific consequence of the new economic system born from the search for new routes. The plantation economies producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton demanded labor on a scale that voluntary migration could not meet. The result was a systematic, brutal transfer of millions of individuals from Africa to the Americas, a foundational element of the Atlantic economy that created profound and lasting demographic changes across 4 continents. The scale of this movement reshaped societies, cultures, and gene pools in the Americas, while impacting regions in Africa for generations. To discuss this is to acknowledge one of the deepest human costs of the economic reconfiguration that began in the 15th century, a period where the pursuit of commodity wealth redefined the meaning of human capital in the most tragic terms. After the formal abolition of slavery in the 19th century, the insatiable demand for plantation labor did not cease. It simply found a new system. The era of indentured labor began, creating another wave of global human movement. Millions of Indian laborers, along with smaller numbers from China and other regions, entered into contracts to work on sugar, rubber, and tea plantations in the Caribbean, Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Their journeys, while under a different legal framework, were often marked by hardship and limited freedom. The story of these indentured workers is a poignant chapter in this legacy. A farmer from rural Uttar Pradesh seeking escape from famine or poverty might sign a multi-year contract to work on a sugar estate in Trinidad or Natal. Upon arrival, they entered a life of grueling labor, but they also carried their languages, religions, and customs with them. Over generations, these communities put down roots, creating entirely new cultural landscapes. Today, the presence of Hindu temples in the Caribbean, the popularity of curry in South Africa, and the Tamil festivals of Malaysia are direct living results of these labor flows. They are the human sediment deposited by the currents of global trade, creating societies of astonishing diversity far from their original homelands. From the Armenian counting house to the Indian laborers' barracks, these movements show that the reconfiguration of trade routes was never just about geography or goods. It was about people, their skills, their suffering, and their resilience. The ethnic enclaves, the merchant networks, and the transplanted cultures we see in our world today are not accidents of history. They are the enduring human architecture of a system built when one gateway closed and countless others, for better and for worse, were forced open. These communities became the permanent nodes in the network, the keepers of cross-border trust, and the living legacy of an economic shock that sent ripples through human populations for centuries. The Ever Given, lodged sideways in the Suez Canal for 6 days in 2021, was more than a news story. It was a 500-year-old echo. A single ship in a single narrow passage held up nearly $10 billion in trade each day. The image felt hauntingly familiar, a stark reminder that our hyper-connected world still pivots on a handful of vulnerable points, just as it did when Constantinople fell. This reveals a timeless tension at the heart of all networks, the push and pull between efficiency and resilience. Complexity theorists who study systems from the internet to ecosystems point to a fundamental rule. The most efficient network is often a straight line, a single, optimized route. That was the beauty and the fatal flaw of the medieval system. For centuries, the Silk Road and the Bosporus Strait formed the ultimate efficient highway, a direct conduit for wealth. But this efficiency came at the cost of fragility. The entire network's health depended on the stability of one city, one corridor. Its fall was a classic single point of failure, cascading into economic shock across a continent. The response was to build a different kind of network. The age of exploration created a decentralized web of sea routes, a system with built-in redundancy. If a storm closed the Cape of Good Hope, a ship could, in theory, try the long way around. If one colonial port fell into conflict, companies could shift operations to another. This new model was far more resilient, but it was not without its own profound risks. Decentralization traded the risk of a single political collapse for a myriad of other dangers: piracy on the high seas, catastrophic storms, and the immense logistical challenge of coordinating across vast, lonely distances. The network was harder to break, but its individual strands were perpetually frayed by new and unpredictable forces. We see this same historical negotiation playing out in our modern economy, often in our pursuit of lean efficiency. Consider the principle of just-in-time manufacturing. A car factory might keep only a few hours' worth of microchips or wiring harnesses on hand, relying on a perfectly timed global dance of shipments to keep the assembly line moving. This system minimizes cost and waste, mirroring the lean efficiency of the medieval spice caravans. But when a pandemic, a natural disaster, or a grounded container ship disrupts one link, the entire production line halts. The recent global shortage of semiconductor chips, which idled auto plants and delayed electronics, is a direct parallel to the medieval pepper panic. Both were shortages of a critical component, one that traveled through long, complex chains and became scarce when a single node faltered. The medieval world learned through crisis that redundancy is not waste, it is insurance. It built multiple routes, Our modern networks, however, in their drive for maximum efficiency and shareholder value, have often streamlined that redundancy away, centralizing production and relying on ever thinner margins of error. So we must ask ourselves a reflective question as we engineer supply chains of breathtaking complexity and build digital networks that span the globe. Are we remembering the ancient lesson written in the Fall of Constantinople? The pursuit of efficiency is a powerful engine of progress, but without deliberate design for resilience, it builds a palace on a single, slender pillar. The echo from 1453 is not just a story of the past, it is a quiet, persistent warning. Our interconnected world is a magnificent achievement, but its greatest strength, its dense interdependence, is also its most profound vulnerability. That slender pillar of vulnerability now runs along the ocean floor as bundles of glass fiber. The modern equivalents of spice galleons are not made of wood, but of light, carrying data packets instead of peppercorns along submerged cables that trace the ghostly outlines of ancient sea lanes. The competition to control these digital flows is the 21st century's great spice race, a silent, high-stakes struggle where information is the ultimate commodity. Tech analysts observing this new landscape note a familiar pattern. Just as the Ottoman Empire understood that power came from controlling the Bosporus, certain nations today recognize that immense influence comes from controlling key internet infrastructure, from the physical cables to the rare earth minerals essential for manufacturing the servers and smartphones that access them. The strategic choke points are no longer just geographic straits, but technological standards and the undersea maps of fiber optic networks. Consider the global debate over 5G networks. The push by some nations to establish their telecommunications companies as the primary builders of this next-generation infrastructure is not merely a business competition. It is a bid to set the foundational rules of the digital realm, much like a maritime power of old seeking to dictate the laws of the sea. This struggle extends to the very concept of cyber sovereignty, where governments assert the right to control, monitor, and wall off the digital information flowing within their borders, creating what some scholars cautiously term digital spheres of influence. In this new domain, the actors most resembling the powerful chartered trading companies are our modern tech giants. Companies like the one that began as a social network, or the one that dominates online search, operate global platforms that govern the movement of attention, commerce, and personal data. They lobby governments for favorable regulations, establish their own internal economies with digital currencies, and even provide foundational services that nations rely upon. Their platforms are the new trading posts and market squares, and the data generated by every user interaction is the raw material they refine into unprecedented wealth and power. Think of a single scroll through a social media feed. Each like, share, and pause is a tiny, valuable datum, harvested in real time, bundled with billions of others, and monetized through targeted advertising. This constant flow of behavioral data is the new spice, a resource that seems intangible yet fuels a multi-trillion-dollar industry. The ancient imperative to control the channels of valuable exchange has not vanished. It has simply entered the ether, proving that the patterns set in motion centuries ago continue to shape our most cutting-edge realities. That silent race for digital spice is now colliding with a powerful new idea, the promise to dissolve the gatekeepers entirely. The ancient struggle between centralized control and distributed networks is entering its most radical phase yet, with technologies like blockchain proposing a future where trade does not flow through hubs, but through a peer-to-peer web of direct, verified exchange. This is the vision of decentralized finance, or DeFi, and its proponents see it as the logical next step in a 500-year journey. Just as ocean routes bypassed the land-based toll collectors of the Ottoman Empire, blockchain aims to bypass the modern financial intermediaries, the banks, the payment processors, and even the centralized digital platforms. At its core, blockchain is a distributed ledger, a shared record of transactions maintained across thousands of computers simultaneously, making it nearly impossible to alter or control by any single entity. A futurist observing this shift might note the profound historical echo. The trust that was once guaranteed by the gold solidus of Constantinople, then by the signature of a Lloyd's underwriter, could one day be encoded in transparent, unbreakable lines of code. This points toward a potential return to a more multipolar, distributed system of trade, where reliance on any single hub, currency, or corporate intermediary is dramatically reduced. The implications ripple far beyond finance. Consider the parallel rise of additive manufacturing, commonly known as 3D printing. For decades, the logic of globalization has been to manufacture goods where labor is cheapest and ship them worldwide. 3D printing inverts this logic. It allows for the digital blueprints of a product, say a specialized machine part, to be sent instantly across the globe and then physically printed in a small workshop or even a home, using locally sourced feedstock materials. This localization of production could profoundly alter commodity flows, reducing the need for shipping countless finished goods and instead moving smaller quantities of raw materials or powdered metals. It is a shift from moving products to moving designs. Combine this with the transition to renewable energy, and another pillar of the old system trembles. As nations generate more power from sun and wind locally, the geopolitical urgency to control fossil fuel shipping lanes, those modern Bosporus straits for oil, could gradually diminish. Economists debate whether these converging trends will lead to more resilient, sustainable networks or to a new age of fragmentation. Regional trade blocs are already strengthening, creating powerful economic zones that may operate by their own digital and environmental standards. This could foster stability within blocs but increase friction between them. The environmental and social sustainability of future trade is now a central question. Can we build systems that value circularity and fair labor as much as speed and low cost? Imagine a near-future scenario. A medical device is digitally designed by a team in Sweden. The design file, secured and sold via a smart contract on a blockchain, is purchased by a hospital in Kenya. The hospital uses a 3D printer to manufacture the device on site, using a biocomposite material sourced from a certified sustainable supplier in Brazil. Payment is made instantly with a cryptocurrency, automatically splitting revenue between the designers, the material supplier, and a royalty for the patent holder, with every step recorded transparently. This is a completely reconfigured supply chain, shorter, more direct, and potentially more responsive to local needs. It echoes the old caravan trade in its distributed nature, but supercharges it with digital certainty. So we are left with a reflective and perhaps unsettling question. With these technologies promising to dismantle centralized choke points and redistribute economic power, are we on the cusp of a new Fall of Constantinople moment for our current globalized system? The towering hubs, the dominant currencies, and the entrenched corporate intermediaries of today might face their own moment of profound reconfiguration. History offers a clear lesson: trade networks are never static. They are living architectures, constantly being torn down and rebuilt by the dual engines of crisis and innovation. The seismic shift that began with a blocked strait in 1453 taught us that the search for new routes never truly ends. It simply changes form, moving from sea lanes to digital protocols, from spice caravans to data streams. The fall of Constantinople was not an end but a violent rebirth. A single city's collapse acted as a catalyst, shattering a coherent world order and compelling the frantic, scattered creation of another. We have traced its echoes not as faint whispers from a dusty past, but as the active, humming foundations of our present. The strategic obsession with maritime straits, the corporate architecture of the joint stock company, the very logic of insurance and futures markets, all were forged in the white-hot crisis that followed 1453. A blocked gateway forced a revolution in navigation, a reinvention of finance, and a new diplomacy of trade treaties, setting enduring patterns of core and periphery, of commodity flows and human movement that map directly onto our modern world. As we navigate our own era of trade tensions, supply chain fragility, and digital upheaval, this deep history is more than a story, it is a lens. It empowers us to see past the headlines and recognize the underlying structures at play. The anxiety over a grounded container ship in the Suez Canal is the same species of anxiety felt by a Genoese merchant watching the Ottoman banners rise over the Theodosian walls. The corporate scramble to diversify suppliers mirrors the Portuguese crown's desperate push down the African coast. Our debates over data sovereignty and digital choke points are the latest chapter in a 500-year struggle over who controls the channels of valuable exchange. This journey reveals a profound truth about the geography of wealth. It is never fixed. It is a landscape in perpetual motion, shaped less by mountains and rivers than by human decisions, crises, and innovations. Our global network, for all its technological majesty, is built upon ancient fractures and learned responses. The ruptures of the past, like the one that closed the Bosporus, do not simply fade. They become the seismic faults along which new economic continents are built. Understanding this grants us a clearer view of our own crossroads. It reminds us that resilience is not a natural state, but a conscious design, and that the most critical map for any era is not one of territory, but one of connection, vulnerability, and flow. If this exploration into the living legacy of a single historical moment resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into how the past actively shapes our present. We would love to hear your perspective. Which modern trade choke point, physical or digital, do you believe holds the most critical leverage over our interconnected world today?